Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this presentation we're going to be going through three general categories of jump training that we can use to develop explosive power and enhance our athletic performance in our sport. So the three categories are basically listed here. So the first one is high loaded jumps, which is basically jumps that using external load that's quite high. Low load jumps are going to be pretty much the same thing, except we're going to use either no load or we might use some external load, but it's going to be very low. And then lastly, we have reactive jumps, which are basically typical plyometric exercises that are going to be heavily reliant on the stretch shortening cycle. And all these three categories of jumps have different applications and different times in the year that we can use them. And that's what we're going to cover. So the first one is the high load jumps, which are essentially just jumps which use high external load. So we have a look at this photo here of an athlete doing a vertical jump with a trap bar. He's got it loaded with a decent amount of weight so that he can explode up. He's still jumping, except there's a lot of external load. So the height and the velocity he's going to be jumping with is not going to be that high. So essentially, when we use these high external loaded jumps, what we're doing is we are developing the force production capabilities of the athlete, of the muscles that we use to jump. So this is different to traditional strength training in that we're still actually jumping. So we get an explosive triple extension that's ballistic, which means we're actually going to jump and leave the ground. And this is different to traditional strength training, for example, like a squat, or if you just did a trap bar deadlift, he doesn't actually leave the ground, so it's not an explosive movement. It's just a typical standard range of motion exercise. But the difference here is that with that external load, even though it's quite high, we are still making sure that we're putting as much force into the ground as possible and leaving the ground and jumping as high as possible. So in these exercises with high loads, we can do some exercises that still have some involvement of the stretch shortening cycle, but it's not very reliant on the stretch shortening cycle. So our stretch shortening cycle capabilities, or our reactive strength as it's also commonly known, if those capabilities are not great, it's not really going to influence these exercises too much, influence the performance of them. So an exercise, for example, that may still use the stretch shortening cycle is something like a jump squat with maybe 50% of your 1RM on the bar. So we're going to go down and then explode up as high as we can. We still have some stretch shortening cycle involvement because of that transition from the eccentric to the concentric phase, but it's not going to influence our jump that much. So some common exercises that we can use high loads with are going to be jump squats, as just mentioned, with fairly high loads. So anywhere between maybe 80% of your 1RM and 40% of your 1RM. And then we can have jumps that are going to start from a bottom-up position, which completely eliminates the stretch shortening cycle. So for example, you could sit on a box with possibly some external load as well, and then from there just explode up, maybe do a box jump, or stick the landing. Either or, we're still removing that stretch shortening cycle, and it's going to be heavily reliant on our force production capabilities. Another one, it can be the trap bar jump, as we see in this picture, with fairly high loads as well. So moving on to our low load jumps, these are essentially the same thing, except these jumps are going to use no load or possibly some external load, but that external load is going to be quite low. So what these jumps do is they teach the body and the muscles involved to produce high forces very quickly. So if we think about the high load jumps, they teach that force production, so they allow us to produce more force. This is going to allow us to produce those high forces that we've built, but this is going to teach us to produce them quickly. So again, These exercises may have moderate involvement of the stretch shortening cycle, so slightly more than the high load jumps, but still not a huge reliance on them. And the exercises we can do for this low load jump category are going to be things like unweighted box jumps or broad jumps. So as we can see here in the picture, we have an athlete about to do a standing broad jump, so standing in one spot, going down and about to propel themselves as far as they can. So there's still some load, well, there's no external load, but there's still a decent amount of load with just the body weight, but it's not high external loads. So another exercise we can do is low loaded box jumps or broad jumps. So the same thing, but this time we can hold some weights in order to add a little bit of external load. Or we can do things like the same sort of exercises but unilateral. So box jumps, single leg, broad jumps, single leg, those sort of exercises. And finally, we have reactive jumps. So reactive jumps are basically jumps which are heavily reliant on the stretch shortening cycle. So we're really taking advantage of the elastic properties of the tendons, particularly the Achilles tendon. So if we think of these reactive jumps, we're talking more about the typical plyometric type exercises that are used. So things like drop jumps, hurdle jumps, and rolling bound jumps. So doing continuous broad jumps. And what these reactive jumps do is, as mentioned, they really capitalize on the elastic properties of the tendon. So we still have that base force production that we developed in the past two categories of jumping. But now we're going to pair that force production with the stretch shortening cycle, which is going to allow us to get the most out of our performance, particularly in activities like running and jumping, which are typical in most sports. So it also teaches the coordinated sequencing of the muscle force production. So it actually teaches us the correct timing of when to fire these muscles. So for example, in reactive jumps, we have a thing called pre-tension or pre-activation, which is actually beneficial. It's when the muscles start firing. If we think about this athlete he's going to do continuous jumps over each cone. So before he hits the ground, by doing these reactive jumps, he's teaching his body to actually fire these muscles prior to actually hitting the ground, which then allows us to use more of those elastic properties of the tendon. So it teaches our muscles to act as like an anchor, while taking full advantage of the tendons and the stretch shortening cycle. So again, exercises, drop jumps, so dropping off a box and then having minimal ground contact and jumping as high as you can. Repeated hurdle jumps, something like this, over cones or hurdles, and rolling bounds as previously mentioned. So how do we know when and where to implement these three categories of jumps into our training? So when we periodize our jump training, we generally want to go from the high load jumps to the low load jumps and then to the reactive jumps, and I'll explain why. So the high load jumps, as we mentioned, they develop that base force production capabilities, and essentially that's what human movement is. It's basically your muscles producing force to move the body. So we need to do that first. We need to get our muscles strong and teach them to produce lots of force. So this category of jump training is best to use when the athlete doesn't particularly need to be at their peak or doesn't have any important performances coming up. And that's going to basically develop the base for the next categories. So the low load jumps would follow then that high load jump base block of training. And what this is going to do, as previously mentioned, it's going to add that speed component to the force production. So we're still going to be teaching our body to produce force, but we're going to do it at a faster rate now. So this is going to build on that previous phase. So we're still, if we didn't do this phase before doing this one, we will not be able to actually produce as much force as we potentially could. So again, it's building on that previous phase. And then finally, we want to implement those reactive jumps, so the plyometric type exercises. And that's again so we can take full advantage of the stretch shortening cycle while we're applying those high forces. So this is going to be best to use at a time when the athlete needs to perform at their peak, or they have really important competitions or games coming up. This is the sort of training we want to be doing. But we can't do this all the time, because then we don't have any time to build those base force production capabilities or that speed component. So if we follow this logical progression, we can then plan our training when we need to be at our best, and that's when we want to plan to have lots of plyometric and reactive type jumps. And when we don't particularly need to be at our best, we might have more time to dedicate to base strength and force production training. So if we start with the high load jumps, go to the low load jumps, and then finish off with the reactive jumps when we need to be at our best, you should get some decent results. And that's it for this presentation, guys. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of it. You can follow Flow High Performance on Facebook and on Instagram if you want to have a look at these research infographics. They're basically the latest research summarized into easy to understand pictures, so that you can stay up to date with the latest research in sports performance training without actually having to go into the journals yourself and read the entire article. So make sure to subscribe on YouTube if you haven't already by clicking here, and feel free to watch another video. You might enjoy this one, or check out our latest video posted on the channel here. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this presentation.